Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll talk with AOPA Pilot Magazine columnist Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro about the subtleties you'll find in the performance charts in an aircraft POH. And I'll also talk about two recent fatal takeoff accidents, one of which occurred at a mountain airport that I've been to twice in the 2 weeks leading up to the accident, and I was flying the same aircraft type as the plane that crashed. In our previous episode 192, we talked with Rob Mark, senior editor of Flying Magazine, about how to minimize risk when taking off. So if you didn't hear that episode, please check it out. And if you haven't done so already, click on the subscribe button or the follow button in whatever app that you're listening to me on now. And also click the share button. That's the 3 dots if you're using the Apple Podcast app. And please share the show with a friend. And in whatever app you're listening to, please leave us a 5-star review, and I'll read some of your reviews on a future show. Thanks so much for supporting the show. This week in the news, another pilot learns that flying low can result in criminal charges. Airships may be in your future travel plans. And a pilot with a unique handicap completes a solo trip around the world. All this and more, and the news starts now. From the Facebook page for the Bay County Sheriff's Office, that's in Panama City Beach, Florida, pilot charged after recklessly flying over the crowds at the Gulf Coast Jam. The Bay County Sheriff's Office is looking for the pilot of a small plane that flew at approximately 300 feet over crowds at the Gulf Coast Jam, alarming attendees, security personnel, and organizers of the event. Out of caution, the concert was stopped and the stage cleared. The pilot has been identified as Robert Ryan Gore, age 40. Gore not only recklessly flew low over the event, but dropped promotional items on top of the 32,000 people in the crowd. A warrant for reckless operation of an aircraft, a felony, has been issued for the arrest of Gore, an Okaloosa County resident. BCSO investigators believe when Gore flew away from the event at Frank Brown Park on Panama City Beach, he landed his aircraft at Okaloosa County. And then an update, they said that Robert Ryan Gore, the pilot of the small plane that flew recklessly above crowds at the Gulf Coast Jam, has been taken into custody. Gore turned himself into authorities in Okaloosa County. Now, we've covered a number of these kinds of stories in recent months, and to listeners who might say, hey, that can't happen, all of this is the FAA's jurisdiction over that airspace, guess what? Times have changed, and the courts have held that local governments can file these kinds of charges. So next time you're thinking of doing some buzzing, take a moment to think about how your mugshot photo might look on the local TV news. From FlyingMag.com, FAA Town Hall on GA Runway Safety offers solutions. Operations at non-towered airports were a specific focus of the seminar on GA Runway Safety hosted by the FAA in June. Any other traffic please advise? Well, probably few radio communications that pilots make incur such wrath as that request, which many pilots still make at the conclusion of an initial call to a Unicom frequency when approaching a non-towered airport. And it was just one of the topics covered by a panel of experienced GA pilots, controllers, and instructors hosted by the FAA representatives during the webinar. The GA Runway Safety Town Hall seminar focused attention on a wide range of safety concerns, and it was positioned to help pilots understand and discuss best practices as recommended by the experts involved and the FAA. The town hall was organized by the FAA for these reasons and more. Quote, lowering the risk of runway accidents is a collective effort that encompasses pilots, air traffic controllers, and airport vehicle drivers. With airport operations expected to increase post-COVID, the FAA is redoubling its effort to offer guidance, resources, and expertise that can preempt any increases in surface errors by GA pilots. A trio of panelists, representing controllers, pilots, and instructors, took questions from the FAA and those in the audience, including controller Carl Grundman, instructor Veronica Cote, and Flying Magazine's senior editor Rob Mark, who of course we had on the show in our last episode. A few gems from the discussion. Google Earth is a resource noted by Mark and Cote, used to augment a pilot's review of airport diagrams and to supplement each other. Other pre-flight tools include EFB apps such as ForeFlight and JetView, a new issuance of AC 91-92, that's the advisory circular. It's called Pilot's Guide to a Pre-Flight Briefing, and the FAA's New from the Flight Deck videos. The series uses cameras from the pilot's point of view to capture runway and taxiway footage, combining them with diagrams and visual graphics to clearly identify hotspots and other safety-sensitive items. Cote also noted the importance of using human resources as well to help with the awareness of hazards such as snowbanks, which aren't too much of a problem this time of year, which can be piled high, making the runway narrower than you're used to, covering taxiway and runway lights. She recommended calling the airport manager before departure so that pilots know about specific runway conditions. From AINonline.com, airship maker says passengers will choose comfort over speed. A company called Hybrid Air Vehicles, or HAV, says its hybrid electric Airlander 10 airship is on track to be ready to carry up to 100 passengers on regional airline services beginning in 2025. Newly released cabin concepts show possible configurations ranging from a spacious 10-seat layout for luxury tours or on-demand urban air mobility services to higher density versions for scheduled city-to-city operations. The UK-based company said the aircraft will be able to support airline routes of up to around 230 nautical miles. However, with a top speed of around 75 knots, the Airlander 10 will be significantly slower than conventional aircraft. Nevertheless, HAV believes it can be competitive by offering passengers the chance to completely bypass airports to fly directly from one downtown location to another, taking off from seafronts, docks, or any flat surface on land. The Airlander features outer hull fabric with helium providing lift, composite structure, and 2 diesel engines, powering a pair of 500-kilowatt electric propulsors. Collins Aerospace is HAV's key partner for the propulsion system, and the Aerospace Engineering Department at the University of Nottingham is also involved in the program. George Land, HAV's Commercial Business Development Director, said, "For many decades, flying from A to B has meant sitting in a metal tube with tiny windows, a necessity but not always a pleasure. On Airlander, the whole experience is pleasant, even enjoyable." According to research conducted by UK industry group Aerospace Defence and Space, around 47% of regional airline flights are shorter than 200 nautical miles. HAV Chief Executive Tom Grundy told AIN that the Airlander can provide a viable alternative to both turboprop and jet airliners, and also train routes for which infrastructure can prove costly and in some locations will likely never be available. The company expects to start a civil certification process later this year and to have 3 aircraft engaged in flight tests by 2023. Grundy says it has raised around $196 million and needs to raise about the same amount again to get the Airlander 10 into production at initial rates of 12 units per year. From AustralianFlying.com.au, SA Flight lands new electric records. South Australian company Air to There, Air by the way is spelled E-Y-R-E, Air to There claims a new record for electric flight. Flying a Pipistrel Alpha Electro, Air to There embarked on a flight of 728 nautical miles from Parafield, and after several stops on a route along South Australia, broke the existing record of 405 nautical miles on a leg between Shoalwater Point Station and Whyalla. During the flight, Air to There also captured new records for an electric aircraft for the longest overwater flight, 16 nautical miles, longest distance flown in any 24-hour period, 178 nautical miles, and the fastest speed between 2 waypoints, 95 knots ground speed. Air to There Managing Director Barry Rogers said the team has battled strong winds and rain, as well as below-zero morning temperatures to achieve the record. Quote, "It's been a mammoth effort by everyone involved to achieve this incredible feat," he said. "The weather hasn't always been on our side. We had ice on the wings one morning, and we're grounded in Port Lincoln due to an intense low-pressure system." And by the way, I would note that it is winter now in Australia. He said on the plus side, the aircraft and the recharging systems have held up incredibly well. It has gone a long way to providing the endurance and reliability of the Pipistrel Alpha Electro plane. Because we can only fly about 125 kilometers before having to recharge, we've been landing in some pretty remote locations, including dirt airstrips at Corunna and Nanning sheep stations on the Eyre Peninsula. Again, that's E-Y-R-E. Rogers shared the flight with pilots Catherine Conway and David Bradshaw, with a support crew made up of 1 non-electric aircraft and 2 vehicles following with the charging equipment. Air to There Aviation has obtained manufacturing rights to the Alpha Electro and plans to build up to 40 aircraft per year, with training organizations the prime market. The long journey is scheduled to end at Adelaide Airport. From AOPA.org, tech startup automates King Airs. Another tech startup has emerged from stealth mode with plans to automate aviation. Merlin Labs, founded in 2018, announced in late May that it has logged hundreds of autonomous missions on multiple aircraft types, including complex twin turboprop aircraft, specifically the Beech King Air. Many of the details remain under wraps. The press release announcing that Merlin Labs exists and has been logging twin turboprop hours flown by an aircraft-agnostic system made to replace all humans on the flight deck omits a few important details such as how the aircraft avoids mid-air collisions. A story posted online the same day by The Verge suggested that the system relies heavily on radar and ADS-B surveillance. Merlin Labs founder Matt George told the technology publication, quote, "The reason that the autonomy up in the air is so much easier is that you have complete vision, at least in the United States, of everything that's up in the sky with ground-based radar." That overstates the coverage and capability of both radar and ADS-B airspace surveillance, which are each unavailable due to terrain and absence of ground-based infrastructure in many locations across the country. TechCrunch noted in its coverage of the announcement that Merlin's system also has natural language processing capability, allowing air traffic controllers to talk to these robotic King Airs as they would if a human were aboard. George told TechCrunch that the system will be able to respond in kind with a high degree of cognition. Now, that's going to be quite the challenge. I know that I sometimes have trouble understanding a few ATC words, so that's going to be a challenge for their system to do that. The company's opening media volley includes a YouTube video that is slickly produced, but offers a few details of exactly how the company plans to secure FAA approval to operate twin turboprops in the National Airspace System with no human pilot on board. Many of this cohort of flying car contenders plan to keep human pilots on board for years to come, in part because that is seen as a much faster path to FAA approval. Reliable Robotics, which has an automated aircraft including a Cessna Caravan that is optionally piloted from engine start to parking and shutdown by human or computer, is among those taking this more conservative approach to expanding the responsibility of the traditional autopilot. Reliable Robotics CEO Robert Rose, who I interviewed earlier this year in episode 173, said in a recent interview that he expects humans will remain in the aircraft control loop for years to come, though possibly from a remote location, and particularly for cargo or repositioning flights with no passengers or crew aboard. Merlin Labs announced that Dynamic Aviation of Bridgewater, Virginia has partnered with Merlin to automate 55 Beechcraft King Airs. The same press release led with news of a $25 million influx in venture capital investment. Neither company involved in the King Air automation project ventured a guess on when FAA approval might be anticipated. Flight testing continues at the Mojave Air and Spaceport Airport in California. From clickorlando.com, firefighting equipment hit helicopter blades prior to fatal crash in Leesburg, according to an NTSB report. The Black Hawk helicopter that crashed in Leesburg, killing 4 on board, was conducting a test flight with a newly installed piece of firefighting equipment when a piece came off and swung into the blades, the preliminary crash report from the NTSB shows. The Black Hawk helicopter crashed during a training exercise May 25th near the Leesburg Airport. Leesburg city officials said all 4 crew members died. The aircraft was registered to Brainerd Helicopters Inc. /Firehawk Helicopters, which contracts with the federal government for firefighting and other services. The FAA and NTSB are investigating, and the NTSB has released its preliminary report. Previously, the FAA said the aircraft was conducting a water drop exercise and lost control of the bucket, causing the rotor section to separate. The chopper went down in a wooded area near the airport and caught fire. According to the NTSB document, a new water tank and snorkel were recently installed on the helicopter for firefighting operations. Snorkels are hoses that allow hovering helicopters to suck loads of water out of natural and man-made sources, according to the Associated Press. After several days of ground testing and calibration, the chopper took its first flight on May 25th with the new equipment. Witnesses told NTSB officials that the helicopter made 6 passes by the air hangar, conducting water drops from a nearby lake before the snorkel came loose. 2 employees noticed and attempted to alert the pilot, according to the report. One employee said he called the Leesburg Air Traffic Control, told the controller to ask the pilot to slow down and land immediately. Before contact was made, the helicopter began gaining altitude, and the witnesses said the snorkel was violently swinging. He then heard a loud bang, which the witnesses believe was the snorkel hitting the main rotor blades. The chopper then started to spin and fell below the tree line, according to the NTSB report. The majority of the helicopter was destroyed in the post-crash fire. From Reuters.com comes a video called Meet California's Mobile Air Traffic Controller. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you the video, but I can tell you a little bit about it. The title says, with fires already sparking across California, Titus Stretch Gall, Titus is his first name, Stretch is his nickname, and Gall is his last name, is gearing up for another long wildfire season. He's ready to roll in with his air traffic control towers, which are on wheels. Now, the company is called Tower Tech Inc., and I went out to their website at twrtech.com, and it says, we are the leading provider of rapid response mobile air traffic control services, FAA-certified air traffic controllers, and state-of-the-art equipment with a single phone call. Tower Tech Inc. is the only FAA-certified provider of positive air traffic control in the country. Our 12 years of service to the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE in air show environments make us uniquely qualified to provide ATC service for your venue. Along with a 32-year air traffic control career, Tower Tech and its controllers understand the culture and needs of the helibase in air show environments. Tower Tech controllers have an average of 28 years of experience. We can be on location and fully operational inside of 24 hours of dispatch with full FAA certification. Now, the website has photos from the air show at Half Moon Bay, which is close by here in Northern California. And they say with a 12-year history of contracts with CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, prove that Tower Tech is a trusted source for many agencies. Now, the photo is really great. It shows what looks like an extra-long camping trailer being pulled by a large pickup truck with a fifth wheel in the back. The back of the trailer is obviously the control tower cab, as it sticks up about, I would guess, 4 feet above the rest of the trailer, and that upper portion is all glassed in on all 4 sides. Now, they describe this trailer, and it says it's a fully functioning tower, living quarters, full kitchen, full bath, weather and communications, ultra-quiet diesel generators. It says Titus Stretch Gall is the owner, and he started the company a few days after retiring as an air traffic controller. So a rather interesting story, and I'll include a link to the video. From DroneDJ.com, here's a story about drones and weather. It says, what's the biggest obstruction to widespread drone deliveries? Government red tape? Customer wariness? The answer may be more elemental than that. It's the elements. A new study suggests that weather may be a roadblock to drone delivery schemes. A new study published in the Nature Scientific Reports looked at how rain and snow, wind and temperature affect drone flyability around the world. Precipitation damages electronics, high winds can cause loss of control, and cold weather can be murder on batteries. This study says most drones used for commercial applications should never fly in rain or snow, but can tolerate temperatures between 0 and 40 degrees C, that would be up to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds up to 36 kilometers per hour, which is somewhere around 20 miles an hour. It then looked at the weather in 100 of the world's most populous cities, found on average that there are only 10 hours a day when the weather lets up sufficiently to let drones fly safely under these conditions. There are regional differences, of course. If you live in sunny Johannesburg, South Africa, your drone-delivered pizza will make it hot and on time. But if you live in Glasgow, where it rains 170 days a year, make backup arrangements if you're expecting a donor kidney. But on average, the high hopes for mass drone deliveries hangs on just 10 hours a day of decent weather. The study says for time-sensitive or emergency drone delivery, those 10 hours are problematic, and waiting for the weather to clear is not an option. The authors go on to say that just upgrading drone weatherproofing could be a partial answer. And I've got to say, I've often thought that drones are being overhyped a little bit as future aircraft solutions, and this might be part of the reason why they may not be as successful as some people think they will be. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. And finally in the news, I frequently see stories of pilots who are planning to fly solo around the world, and I usually don't report on them as they almost are becoming commonplace. But this one stands out. From AOPA.org, One-Eyed Pilot completes circumnavigation in a Bonanza, spreads message of perseverance. Mission accomplished, exclaimed one-eyed pilot Shinji Maeda on June 11th after completing a circumnavigation of the Earth in a 1963 Beechcraft Bonanza V-tail during a mission of perseverance that he said seemed more like Mission Impossible after beginning May the 1st at Payne Field in Washington. When Maeda emerged victoriously from Lucy, the red P-model Bonanza, he waved U.S. and Japanese flags before tearfully embracing his wife and children. "I am home," he declared, after encountering the highs and lows of a mission that mentor and fellow circumnavigator Adrian Eichhorn previously warned him about. Weather, including sandblasting from a Sahara Desert storm, fog in Russia, and brief but harrowing icing conditions, were factors along the route. The native of Japan had suffered a crushed optic nerve as a teenager after a car accident and a lengthy hospital stay. Maeda said he felt like his aviation career aspirations were dashed after he learned that regulations prevented him from pursuing flight training in his home country. The idea for his lifelong Mission Possible mantra began with the encouragement from his father to emigrate to the U.S. and pursue an aviation science degree at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Arizona. A college flight instructor reignited Maida's passion for flight, and the Federal Air Surgeon granted Maida a statement of demonstrated ability. He earned a private pilot certificate, an instrument rating, and a commercial pilot certificate, and became a certificated flight instructor. Through virtual or in-person appearances, social media postings, and videos, Maida has been encouraging young people to explore aviation as a valuable skill. He recognized that flying is a good skill for those considering sciences, technology, and engineering, or math careers, and has been vocal about it since he founded the nonprofit Aero Zapangu Project, which apparently translates to Air Japan, in 2015. The around-the-world flight was a culmination of the messages of hope that Maida dispenses to others. Maida said that when people apply the right mindset and the right attitude toward their lives, things will happen in their favor. Spend the time, make the relationships with the right people, and guess what? You can go from an attitude of that's impossible to one of I am possible. Celebrating aviation, celebrating our lives, and spreading a message of hope to others is all we need. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a couple of recent fatal takeoff accidents, and then we'll have our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro about POH performance charts, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let me give you one quick update before we dive into discussion of the recent fatal takeoff accidents. I did miss getting an episode out last week because my schedule was extremely busy, including a couple of VisionJet flights, which were fun. But then I got a nasty cold at the beginning of this week, which I still haven't fully gotten over. So I apologize for not getting this episode out to you sooner, but sometimes life gets in the way. Now let's talk about a couple of recent fatal takeoff accidents that occurred a couple of weeks ago and within a few days of each other. Both of these were in Cirrus SR20s, though they could have happened in any aircraft type. One of those accidents deeply impacted me as it occurred at an airport in the mountains that I'd been to twice in the prior 2 or 3 weeks prior to the crash, and both of my flights were in SR20s. The other SR20 takeoff accident was heartrending because the apparent cause was so simple, and if properly managed, shouldn't have resulted in a crash. And again, it could have happened in any aircraft type, including the one that you fly most often. The first of these accidents occurred at Truckee, California, which has a field elevation of about 5,900 feet. The crash happened in the morning around 10:45 a.m., shortly after the SR-20 took off from Runway 20. They were staying in right closed traffic, and the crash occurred shortly after they turned to a right crosswind. Interestingly, that differs from the recommended procedure for remaining in right traffic on Runway 20, which is to make a left overhead 270 over the airport before flying over the airport and joining the right downwind. And the overhead 270 is exactly what I did with a client when we took off from Runway 20 about 2 weeks earlier and remained in right closed traffic. I like that procedure as it keeps you over a low meadow with no trees or obstacles and gives you more time to climb before you turn to the downwind. By contrast, if you turn to a right crosswind as the accident aircraft did, the path takes you over more homes in a wooded area and the terrain is slightly higher. At the time of the accident, the density altitude was around 7,500 feet, and when I was there about 2 weeks earlier, it was hotter and the air pressure was lower, so we had a density altitude of just under 8,300 feet. And under those conditions, the SR-20 climbs a little over 300 feet per minute, which should be sufficient regardless of whether you do the left overhead 270 or the right crosswind. Now, things started out well for the accident aircraft as they were climbing. According to FlightAware data, it climbed about 350 feet before it started the turn to the crosswind. But then it slowed somewhat and dropped almost 150 feet in the turn to crosswind before dropping to the ground. And the elevation at the impact point was almost exactly identical to the field elevation, so they were not over higher terrain at that point. Sadly, the 24-year-old CFI on board died, and the other pilot had serious injuries. So while density altitude may be cited as a factor, I think it's unlikely to be cited as the probable cause. Clearly, the aircraft was climbing at the expected climb rate, and shouldn't have impacted terrain. But something happened, and it's not clear at this time what that might have been. Possible causes might have been a partial or total loss of engine power. They might have encountered a downdraft, as winds at the time were gusting up to 20 knots, and this airport is surrounded by mountains that go up to at least 10,000 feet. Or maybe the pilot may have made some unexpected control input that the CFI was unable to counter. The CFI was employed by the local flight school, which is a Cirrus training center, so he most likely had a lot of experience flying an SR-20 out of the Truckee Airport. All I can say is that all of your safety margins are smaller when you're flying in the mountains. And if you're contemplating some future mountain flying or flying under high-density altitude conditions, you might want to first consider flying with a flight instructor just to review the procedures for flying in those conditions. The other fatal takeoff accident occurred only a few days later in Arkansas. In that case, what was so tragic was that the cause was quite obvious, and a well-trained pilot should have been able to deal with it successfully. The image I used for this podcast episode is of that accident aircraft, and depending upon which podcast player you're using to listen to this episode, you may or may not see it. It shows the underbelly of the aircraft, which is up on its nose, and there's a little red thing visible under the wing, and I've added a large arrow that points to it, along with the words pitot cover. Now, I first heard of the crash within an hour or two of it happening, and I want to thank the listener to this show who contacted me with the information. Here's what I posted on COPA, the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association website at cirruspilots.org. I wrote, I had an email and then spoke by phone with one of my Aviation News Talk podcast listeners in Conway, Arkansas. Apparently an SR20 crashed there this afternoon. He believes that it's November 6-2 Whiskey Romeo, as this flight-aware track seems to fit the accident timeline. The aircraft is a rental aircraft in the Sparrow Flying Club. He wrote, Today there was a plane crash at my local airport, KCXW, in Conway, Arkansas. I was not at the airport, but my instructor was, and it was very apparent what happened. It was a stall spin crash on final, but it's not that simple. The pitot cover is still on the airplane. Out of respect for the pilot, I did not take any pictures of the crash site. We still don't know his condition, as the accident just happened a few hours ago. When we talked by phone, he said his instructor observed that the pilot flew the traffic pattern altitude at about 200 to 300 feet AGL, which agrees with the flight-aware track. The field elevation is 276 feet. The pilot apparently had 200 to 300 hours total time. Apparently the pilot was successfully resuscitated at the crash site and was transported to a local hospital. There don't appear to be many news stories out yet, but here's one, and then I included a link. Since I made that initial post, we've learned that the accident pilot did die. Also, I was talking today with another listener to the show who was talking with someone at the airport, and he asked whether the engine cowl plugs were also found. And the answer was yes. The pilot had also apparently forgotten during pre-flight to remove the cowl plugs from the front of the engine. He also noted that the little flags that are often attached to cowl plugs were missing. Now, flags stick up above the cowling and are meant to give the pilot one last chance to notice before starting the engine that he or she forgot to remove the cowl plugs from the front of the engine. But I've often seen cowl plugs where, over time, the flags have pulled loose from the cowl plugs, making it harder to detect from the cockpit that you've forgotten to remove the cowl plugs. In our last episode, 192, Rob, Mark, and I devoted an entire episode talking about how to minimize takeoff risks. And one of the things we talked about was following standard procedures. And one of those standard procedures that professional pilots do on every takeoff, which we talked about, and I hope you will do as well, is that they verify that they are getting full engine power, and then they check the airspeed indicator and call out aloud, airspeed alive, indicating that the airspeed indicator is working properly. That provides a safety check so that you can tell before you rotate and take off into the sky whether or not your airspeed indicator is working. Had the accident pilot done that, he would have noticed that he didn't have any airspeed, and he would have pulled the throttle to idle and braked long before he reached rotation speed. Why is it important to make this a part of your takeoff procedure? Because all pilots, including you and I, make mistakes. And we make tiny mistakes on virtually every flight. But following this standard procedure of checking your airspeed before rotation on every takeoff reduces the chance of ever getting into the air with no airspeed indicator. But even if you do accidentally take off with no airspeed indication, that shouldn't end up in a fatal accident, so don't panic if you do. Just fly the airplane exactly the way you always fly it when you're in the traffic pattern, because you already know the pitch and the power settings you use for each portion of the traffic pattern. And if you fly those same pitch and power settings, you'll get the same airspeed you always get, and you'll be fine. And most airplanes these days have a GPS on board. So after you level off at the traffic pattern altitude and have a spare moment, go to your GPS to display your ground speed. And while it won't be exactly the same as airspeed, it's better than nothing. So if you don't know how to display ground speed on all of the different GPS units in all the airplanes that you fly, commit to figuring that out the next time you fly the airplane. What really compounded the problem for this accident pilot was that after taking off, he flew a very non-standard traffic pattern. Instead of climbing up to a standard traffic pattern altitude of perhaps 800 or 1,000 feet AGL, he only climbed to between 200 and 300 feet AGL. Imagine trying to fly the traffic pattern at that altitude, even if you did have a working airspeed indicator. Everything would look totally different, and you would have to guess as to when to pull power, when to lower the flaps, when to make your turns. But if you were to fly as close to a standard pattern as possible, you'd already know exactly what to do with the power, the pitch, and the flaps at every point along the traffic pattern. One thing this accident had in common with two other Cirrus landing accidents we've discussed on this show is flying a non-standard traffic pattern. For example, in episode 99, we talked about an Air Force test pilot who flew a very non-standard traffic pattern that was much lower and faster than what Cirrus specifies in their flight operations manual, and he had a stall spin accident at his base to turn final. And in episode 130, we talked about a pilot in Southern California who flew a downwind that was very close to the runway and which was several hundred feet low, and he too had a stall spin accident at his base to final turn. So if you remember nothing else from today, please remember this. Always try to fly a traffic pattern in a manner that is standard and customary for the airport you're at. That way, if you have some other problem, such as missing airspeed, you are minimizing the number of other variables that you have to deal with. Because if you have a problem and then fly the traffic pattern in a non-standard way, you'll increase your workload and make your job more difficult because you now have even more variables to deal with. So always make sure you do a thorough pre-flight. Always follow standard procedures such as calling out airspeed alive after verifying that your airspeed indicator is indeed working, and always try to fly close to a normal traffic pattern for the airport you're at, especially when you're dealing with an abnormal situation or an emergency. Coming up next, our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now, our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro includes a lot of different charts that she showed, and for Patreon supporters at the $20 a month and up level, they have already seen the video version of that interview along with the charts. And for those who are listening here on the podcast, what I've done is I've taken all of the images that she's shown and I have inserted them into the podcast as chapter markers. So if you're using a podcast player that can display chapter markers and images, make sure that you look at it so you can see the images that she's referring to. Regardless, if you looked at any type of standard POH charts, you'll probably have a feel for what she's talking about. And now let me tell you a little bit about Catherine Cavagnaro. She's an expert on spins, aerobatics, and upset recovery techniques, and she holds an ATP and CFI certificate and a PhD in mathematics. She's a professor of mathematics at the University of the South and has chaired the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. In 2018, Catherine was named by the FAA as the National FAA Safety Team Representative of the Year, and last year was named the 2020 National CFI of the Year. Catherine also serves as a designated pilot examiner, and she owns a flight school called ACE Aerobatics School that's located at the Sewanee-Franklin County Airport, KUOS, on the campus of the University of the South. She's also a monthly columnist for AOPA Pilot magazine. Now here's our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro. Catherine, great to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Great to see you too, Max. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure having you here. We get a lot of great compliments on the work that you do, which is why we keep bringing you back.
Awesome. Thanks.
I know you've written some articles recently for AOPA magazine, the column that you have there, about performance charts. Now, we were just talking about takeoff, how to minimize risk for takeoffs in last week's episode. Let's talk a little bit about takeoff performance charts. What can you tell us about them?
Well, let me back up to a recent practical exam that I gave for the instrument rating. And I send a lot of these candidates out west because I like to have them deal with terrain and departure and obstacle departure procedures. And I gave this young woman a plan, and we went over her plan, and we were looking at the fuel. And I asked her about how much fuel that this trip would require. And she reported a number that was just so preposterously low that, it really caused me some alarm. She had a 172 with a 195 horse engine. And I asked her, well, okay, in cruise, what are you seeing for fuel burn? And she reported 5.3 gallons an hour, which seemed preposterously low. And I said, okay, well, tell you what, let's get out the POH and maybe you can show me how your electronic flight bag is getting that, because she was relying on software exclusively to do her flight planning. And that's great, but it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the numbers that we are getting out of that program are close to reality. So I asked her to get out her POH and let's look at some performance charts and maybe show me that that would be an appropriate fuel burn. And she brought out the POH, and it soon became clear that she didn't know how to use the performance charts at all. And that's a big problem because, as I said, it's incumbent upon us. It's important to make sure that the profile that we're using makes sense and is representative of our aircraft performance. And what happened in her case is the EFB was actually doing its job, but she had the wrong profile selected for her airplane. So I think it's important for us, again, to dive into our POH on occasion. And for this article, which is in the July issue of Pilot Magazine, I chose to dissect a takeoff performance chart. And it's interesting because it's not only to verify that my airplane's performance is reflected accurately in my EFB software, but you can actually learn some really interesting things by checking out the performance chart. So that's the subject of the article.
Well, I'm glad we have a math professor here to help us with the charts, because obviously there's a lot of things in graphs that may not be obvious to people. So this is great. So go ahead and let's dive right into it.
Okay, sounds great. So the name of my article that is out now is What Matters Most If a Performance Chart Could Talk. And what I'm showing on the screen here is a chart from my Beechcraft Bonanza E33 Charlie airplane. And some POHs have a table. Mine tends to have the chart. And I have to confess, as a mathematician, I delight when I see lines and charts, because every time you see a line with an associated slope, basically that's telling you how two quantities are related to each other. In other words, it's telling you how much one quantity matters with respect to the other. So here is my takeoff distance chart. And one thing I want to mention is that you can see, if you're seeing this online, that in the upper left, we have the takeoff performance is predicated on a certain technique that is used by the pilot. For example, in this case, we assume that the throttle is set to full and the RPM is at 2,700. We've leaned the mixture to an appropriate fuel flow, and this can be really important out west. Out east, we often can get away with having mixture full rich, and that's not going to cut it, of course, when we are at higher altitudes. The flaps are up, and the landing gear will be retracted after a positive climb rate is established, and the cowl flaps are open. Another interesting feature that this chart has is a reminder that when the weight of the aircraft goes down, we need to use a lower rotation speed and we need to use a lower airspeed for our VX climb. So in this case, we have a handy chart that tells us some airspeeds for various aircraft weights. Also, it has an example given, and this is common for a lot of aircraft POHs. So something that I advocate is every once in a while, or maybe for each trip, pick one performance item. If you haven't done this in a while, pick one performance item and go ahead and verify that your EFB is doing its job, or that you have the correct profile for your aircraft. So this gives us an example that we can mimic. And in this performance chart, you'll see some line segments that take you through the calculations. So if it's been a while and you don't remember how to use the performance chart, you can check out the example and you can typically mimic that. All right, so for my article, what I did is I redrew the picture or the takeoff chart just to make it a bit clearer. Some of those old POHs are not exactly the clearest. So this is a chart that has the same information. And what I'd like to do is talk about the 4 panels. Reading left to right, you input your temperature in the leftmost panel and move up to the pressure altitude. And if you move to the right, you'll basically calculate density altitude. So what I ended up doing on the first reference line is superimposing the associated density altitudes. So the leftmost panel is nothing more than a density altitude calculator. And what that says is that any combination of field elevation, temperature, and altimeter setting that produces the same density altitude is going to produce the same performance, other items equal. The next panel over is factors weight in the picture. And these are downward sloping lines. And the idea is that when you enter the second panel, you are at max gross weight. And as you slope downward along the line, you're basically taking into account the weight of the aircraft. When you get to the point that sits above the weight of the aircraft, then you move straight across to the next reference line. And the slopes of these lines are actually pretty dramatic. You can have for example, if I am flying at 2,900 pounds instead of the 3,300 pound max gross, that's a 12% weight decrease. And it turns out that my ground roll will decrease by 26%. So that shows the profound effect that weight has on takeoff performance.
Well, I guess what that really tells us is that if you're in a short field takeoff situation, it really pays not to top off the tanks before you take off. For example, I'm always telling folks when we do our mountain checkouts at Lake Tahoe, where the field elevations are around 6,000 feet, that they really shouldn't just automatically top off the tanks when they land, because we're going to get much better performance, and we can always get fuel later on as we get back down to lower altitude airports.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, there's always a way to avoid an uncomfortable situation like that. Another way to solve that problem, years ago, even though my home airport is at about 2,000 MSL, we get some pretty hot days here, and we can easily be up 4,000 or 5,000 feet density altitude. And my kids and I were going on a trip, and I really just didn't feel comfortable packing everything in the airplane and putting my kids in. I don't think I'd win Mother of the Year award taking off on a hot day. So what I did is I just drove my kids down to the airport down in the valley, and it's 1,000 feet lower, and the runway is a good bit longer. I just dropped them off with the bags. I drove back to Sewanee, my home airport. I took off and landed, picked everybody up with the bags, and we had an easy takeoff from that much longer runway. So there's always a solution, whether that's leaving fuel off or maybe even just taking your passengers to a nearby airport where you're going to get much better performance.
Yep, it always makes sense to think creatively when you face these kinds of situations and not just cross your fingers and hope that things will work out.
Exactly, yeah. All right, so the third panel in this takeoff performance chart factors winds into the situation. And the lines for the headwind slope downward. And for example, if I take off in a no wind condition, given my 2,900 pound takeoff weight, and I have no winds, then my ground roll should be about 1,275 feet. If I have a 10 knot headwind, then my takeoff distance goes down by about 18%. But if I take off with a 10 knot tailwind, it increases by 37%. So if you're able to see this performance chart, you'll notice that the steepness of the tailwind lines are much greater than those of the headwind. So what it says is that a tailwind hurts you way more than a headwind helps you. Now, sometimes there's actually a good reason to take off with a tailwind. I will take off from my home airport with a slight tailwind. And the reason that I do that is on one of our runways, you get an uphill right when you least need it. So that uphill is worth more than the tailwind. So in any case, I will take off with a slight tailwind. So sometimes there's a good reason for it, but never take off with a tailwind without a compelling reason for that.
And I was on a flight recently where I went to Blue Canyon Airport, which is at about 5,000 feet. And we had the situation where we had a tailwind with a upsloping runway, and then a headwind with a downsloping runway. And we had to spend a lot of time as we were flying up there trying to figure out which combination was going to be the best. And it did turn out that it was landing into the headwind, even though it was downsloping. It was the best thing to do in that situation. Now, I'm looking at your charts, and it doesn't say anything about slope. Is that information contained elsewhere in the POH for your airplane?
This performance chart is silent on the issue of slope. So you have to use your experience. And, sometimes it helps to talk to a local. Like I'll tell people that, gosh, taking off on runway 6, you get that really unfortunate uphill. So, for takeoff, I'll often take off on 2-4 with a tiny bit of a tailwind, as I said earlier. And, sometimes it helps to talk to that local who has the experience there. But this performance chart is silent on the issue of slope.
Okay.
All right. And then the last panel, I think, is really fascinating to me. And it talks about it adds the distance to climb over a 50-foot obstacle. And one thing, of course, you want to be careful of is not all obstacles are 50 feet. And my home airport has the trees that surround it are between 80 and 100 feet tall. So that's something to consider, that 50 feet isn't necessarily going to get you over the obstacles, the real obstacles that are around your airport. And another thing that's fascinating that it honestly never dawned on me until I picked apart this takeoff distance performance chart for this article. But when you come into the reference line on the left, if you draw a straight line across, it gives you your ground roll. And if you follow the line segments to the upper right, it tells you your distance to climb over a 50-foot obstacle. But what that says is that apparently this performance chart is telling us that no matter what conditions you have in terms of atmospheric conditions, weight, and wind, if you enter that panel on the left and just merely draw a parallel line to the line segments that you see in the fourth panel, that will be your added distance to climb over a 50-foot obstacle. But that can't be correct at all. Because, for example, if you chose to take off with a tailwind, that tailwind is going to continue to hurt you as you try to climb over that 50-foot obstacle. So that's a real gotcha. I mean, you really have to back up, and I wouldn't trust that fourth panel. And in fact, I would prefer to maybe introduce the idea of a climb gradient and maybe look at the performance chart for climb rate instead of looking at that fourth panel. So honestly, that never really dawned on me until I really took apart this performance chart.
Well, I think a key message to take away from that is that our POHs sometimes don't always have the exact information we might need for the worst kinds of circumstances, which is why as pilots we really want to build a lot of margin into our calculations. And I'll take a Cirrus Vision Jet, for example, which I was out flying today. I had to move one, and I still recall that in the training they said add 50% to everything. So if you're looking at landing distances, add 50%. And I think this is just a great example where, don't just take the numbers from the POH, go ahead and add a good healthy percentage of safety margin.
Right. And on some practical exams, candidates will say to me, and this is a little painful, there may be a student pilot who is going for a private pilot certificate, and they'll say something like, well, gosh, I want to be conservative here. I'll add 10%. And I think to myself, I double it. I add a minimum of 50% and maybe even double these figures. I know that sounds pretty conservative, but honestly, it has served me well, and it's kept me from hitting things. So I'll continue to use that.
10%. All I can say is, what an optimist.
I know, exactly. Yeah. So, all right. So what I ended up doing in the article was I took a specific scenario just to show people how to use these charts. And again, we want some takeaways here. So this scenario has us taking off from an airport that sits at 7,284 feet MSL, which happens to be Laramie, Wyoming. And let's see, the pressure, the altimeter setting is 30.22 inches of mercury. The temperature is 17 degrees Celsius. We're taking off with 2,900 pounds, so 400 pounds below gross, into a 10-knot headwind. Now, when I give a scenario for a practical exam, sometimes people forget that we're looking for a pressure altitude here. So in order to use this chart, you're going to have to compute a pressure altitude. And the way that you do that is with this formula. You'll take 29.92 and subtract your altimeter setting, take that result, multiply it by 1,000, and add it to the field elevation. So for example, when we take 29.92 and we subtract 30.22, that gives us -0.3. And when we multiply that by 1,000, that gives us -300, which we then add to our field elevation of 7,284, and that gives us 6,984 feet pressure altitude. So that higher pressure, that higher altimeter setting means we have a higher pressure, and that means that our pressure altitude is actually lower than our field elevation. So that means that higher pressure is actually giving us 300 feet of help in terms of pressure altitude. It's not a lot. But what it says is we're getting a little bit of help from pressure.
And I still remember talking with a local DP years ago after I first became a CFI, and he said, just think of it this way. High pressure is good for airplanes because you have more molecules flowing over the wing, so the airplane is going to perform better. So that's the same as if it were taking off from a lower elevation airport with denser air.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, in terms of I don't know what kinds of altimeter settings you fly with, Max, but in the general scheme of things, the lowest I usually see is something like 29.6 something or 29.7 something. And I think the highest I've noticed when I've been out flying is about 30.7-ish. So what that means is really the pressure altitude for the kind of flying I do is never going to be more than, say, probably 700 feet lower than field elevation, or maybe 300-ish feet higher than field elevation. So pressure can help or hurt, but in the grand scheme of things, temperature has a bigger effect, and you can see that from the chart. So For example, we're at 7284 for our field elevation. And again, our pressure altitude brought us down to 6984. Now, our temperature is 17 degrees centigrade. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, 15 degrees is standard. Well, 15 degrees is standard at sea level. But if it goes down at about 2 degrees per 1,000 feet, it would be more like 1 degree is standard for Laramie. So we are a full 16 degrees centigrade warmer than standard. And you'll see what that's going to do to our density altitude. For example, I'll draw a line up from 17 degrees up to our pressure altitude of right around 7,000 feet. And when we go over, we'll see that our density altitude is almost 9,000 feet. So we got a 300-foot help from pressure, and we got about a 2,000 feet hurt from temperature. So it goes to show you the profound effect that temperature can have. So we leave that leftmost panel with a density altitude of almost 9,000 feet. So that's pretty high. When we enter the next panel, we're going to move down to the point that sits over our 2,900 pounds, and then we're going to move straight across to the next reference line. And I gave you some ballpark figures in terms of percentage help. That 12% weight decrease basically is, all other things equal, going to give us about a 26% decrease in ground roll, for example. So that was a big help, taking off with 400 pounds below gross. Now, given that we have a 10-knot headwind component, actually I'll point out that on practical exams, it's often the case that, say my runway is 1836, so directly north-south, and we have winds at, say, 10 knots out of, say, 290, people will just automatically use the 10 knots in this panel, in that third panel, when remember, you really have to, most of that is going to be devoted to the crosswind, and you're not going to get a whole lot of help from that 10 knots coming from 290 if you, say, are taking off on runway 36. Not much of that is going to help you. So always make sure you're keeping, or you're computing, the actual headwind component of the winds. So I'm going to assume that I have a 10-knot headwind component. And again, I gave some rough numbers that 18% decrease in this case, or that 10 knots is actually equating in terms of the ground roll to about an 18% decrease. So instead of 1,275 in a no wind condition, I'm looking at about 1,050 feet of ground roll for a 10-knot headwind. So that's a nice help there. If I had a 50-foot obstacle to climb over, then I would be looking at about, it looks like about 1,700 feet to climb over a 50-foot obstacle. But remember the caveats there, that first of all, not all obstacles are actually 50 feet. And second of all, again, if that wind died down or it swung around to a tailwind, then that performance would not be particularly accurate. And again, to highlight how terrible a tailwind can be, then I followed that up along the tailwind line and came across to see that the ground roll would be 37% higher. So that's that 1,700 feet or 1,750 feet if I took off with the tailwind. But what's really eye-watering at this point is if we look at the distance to climb over a 50-foot obstacle, now instead of, if using the 10-knot headwind, we'd be at about 1,750 feet. If we took off with a 10-knot tailwind, This is telling us that it would be about 3,300 or 3,350 feet. But again, that is not taking into account that that tailwind is going to continue to hurt me as I climb away. So I think that's some pretty eye-watering numbers with respect to taking off with a tailwind.
It's rather remarkable. You look at the range of numbers you've just presented there, it's over a 3-to-1 range. If you look at the best case, it was just slightly over 1,000 feet to take off. If you look at the worst case, it was well over 3,000 feet, so more than 3-to-1 difference. And I think a lot of people probably think that, all these factors might increase my distances by, 10, 20% or something like that. But boy, if you take them in the extreme and you start adding all of the worst case variables, they can get really bad in a hurry.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, it's really interesting to pick this apart just to show the effects that these various factors have on takeoff performance. And, I learned something in the process too. So whenever I really pick apart something from the POH, I come away smarter about my airplane for the effort. And I also want to point out that these items come from the July issue of Pilot Magazine, but there's also a reference to an earlier article about learning to call BS. And that's just basically saying don't put complete faith into your EFB. They do a great job, but we can make mistakes in there too by choosing the wrong profile. Or here's something, I have 2 airplanes, and sometimes when I'm flight planning, I realize, I had the wrong airplane selected for this flight, and that's why it looks so crazy. So I think in dissecting these performance charts, what it's helping us do is learn to be better consumers of the information that our EFBs are giving us. So these are the 2 articles that are referenced here. And as always, I am glad to have any comments that anybody has.
And what would you suggest or recommend for someone who, for example, maybe they have had their private for a year or 2, but they haven't really gotten into the POH lately because they use rules of thumb. Hey, when I take off my home airport and I know there's just 2 people, unless it's outrageously hot, I don't need to worry about it. What kind of recommendations or exercises would you suggest to them to kind of get into their POH more?
Oh, right. And, the thing is, we all do that, right? I have my kids and I go flying, and it's the same 3 of us. And, sometimes we make the same trip again and again. And, I don't necessarily run the performance numbers on every one of those flights. But when things are going to be significantly different, that's a time to get out the POH and take a look. And it could just be difference because it's time of year. Anybody who's taken off January versus July knows the profound effect that, for example, density altitude has on performance. So I think it's just a matter of discipline. Every once in a while, get out those POHs. And the thing is, if you don't do that, then some of these calculations become black boxes. And once a calculation becomes a black box, meaning that you can't verify the items from, say, your EFB, then that really is a problem, and safety is an issue there. So I just make a habit of, say, once a month, I pull out my POH and I dissect one of the charts. Or maybe I'm looking at an emergency procedure that I don't remember so well anymore. I just think we all need the discipline to get out those POHs and learn from them.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking perhaps it makes sense for people to, when they've got some spare time, do a little exercise at home, even if they don't have a particular trip coming up, but just kind of look at the extremes. What's it like if I'm taking off in the winter at my home airport? What's it going to look like on a really bad day at my airport? The airplane's fully loaded. It's a hot day. It's, 35 Celsius outside or something like that. And maybe also just think about the highest airport that they might possibly go to, see what the high temperatures are at that airport, and just use that as an exercise to make sure they know how to use their charts long before they even have a trip to one of these places.
Absolutely. And that can be surprising too. I just gave a practical exam just a few days ago. And like I said, I send a number of instrument and CFII candidates out west. And he said, he brought his performance chart to me, and he was very good about using them. But he said, there isn't even a line for this altitude, for this pressure altitude on my performance chart. In other words, he'd be extrapolating. And that's something that should give you pause. So he said, for that reason alone, this flight's a no-go. And I liked that. I think that was great. So you'd be surprised. Sometimes you take out your performance chart and it's off the charts, so to speak. And that's bad. So I like your idea of looking at extremes, and it doesn't necessarily take a super hot day sometimes for us to get sent off the charts.
Yeah, in fact, I was really close to being off the charts just a couple of weeks ago. We were up at Truckee, which is at 5,900 feet, and it was probably about 27, 28 degrees Celsius out. I forget what the pressure was, but we were right around 8,000 feet density altitude. And when you looked at it all, it's like, wow, we a couple more degrees and we would be off the chart. I always tell people at that point that you're a test pilot and you're not trained or paid to be a test pilot. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go ahead and fly when you're going to be off the charts.
Exactly. Yeah. In mathematics and statistics, we talk about that too. The dangers of extrapolation make no sense. That makes no sense because the data were not gathered with those, say, in this case, altitudes in mind.
Well, and when you extrapolate, the assumption you're using is that the data is linear. And what you've just showed is a lot of this is not linear.
And in fact, if you take a look at the leftmost panel of this performance chart, you'll see it is not linear. You'll see that the pressure altitude lines start getting farther apart as you move up. So that is a great indication right there that it is not linear.
Well, and you can see that pretty easily. For example, we kind of estimate that for every 1,000 feet that we're going to lose an inch of pressure, and we've got about 30 inches of pressure at the surface. If that were linear, at 30,000 feet, there would be no air left. And of course, airplanes still fly at 30,000 feet, so it's a very nonlinear function.
Exactly.
Well, good. So, Catherine, where do people go to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, my website is acerobaticschool.com. I'm a columnist for AOPA Pilot Magazine, so you can catch me each month there as well.
Well, Professor, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Max, it is always a pleasure. I love it.
And my thanks to Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro for joining us again. She is making such great contributions to general aviation, and I'm delighted to say that we expect to have her back on the show again soon. Be sure to check out her monthly column in AOPA Pilot Magazine, and of course, look in our show notes and you'll have links to her flight school. And since I'm still not 100% healthy, I'm going to wrap things up. Let me just briefly mention that if you'd like to support the show financially, 2 easy ways to do that. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can sign up via Patreon. Just enter a credit card and you can make a monthly donation at various levels, and you can see what goodies are available at each of the levels. Or if you'd like to make just a one-time contribution, head on out to PayPal. You don't even need a PayPal account to do it. Just enter your credit card at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.